Hello children, it's Grandma Carla, and I'm here with more of Beezus and Ramona. We've read chapter 1, so this is chapter 2. Beezus and her imagination. Beezus and Ramona both looked forward to Friday afternoon after school. Beezus because she attended the art class in the recreation center in Glenwood Park. Ramona because she was allowed to go to the park with Beezus and play in the sand pile until the class was over. This Friday, while Beezus held Ramona by the hand and waited for the traffic light to change from red to green, she thought how wonderful it would be to have an imagination like Ramona's. "Oh, you know, Ramona, her imagination runs away with her," Mother said when Ramona made up a story about seeing a fire engine crash into a garbage truck. "That child has an imagination a mile long," the Quimbleys' grown-up friends remarked when Ramona sat in the middle of the living room floor in a plastic wading pool she had dragged up from the basement and pretended that she was in a boat in the middle of a lake. "Did you ever see so much imagination in such a little girl?" the neighbors asked one another when Ramona hopped around the yard pretending that she was the Easter Bunny. One spring day, Ramona had gotten lost because she started out to find the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. The rainbow had appeared to end in the park until she reached the park, but then it looked as if it ended behind the supermarket. When the police brought Ramona home, Father said, "Sometimes I think Ramona has too much imagination." "Nobody," reflected Beezus, "ever says anything about my imagination. Nobody at all." And she wished more than anything that she had imagination. How pleased Miss Robbins, the art teacher, would be with her if she had an imagination like Ramona's. Unfortunately, Beezus was not very good at painting, at least not the way Miss Robbins wanted boys and girls to paint. She wanted them to use their imagination and to feel free. Beezus still squirmed with embarrassment when she thought of her first painting, a picture of a dog with bow wow coming out of his mouth in a balloon. Miss Robbins pointed out that only in funny papers did dogs have bow wow coming out of their mouths in balloons. Bow wow in a balloon was not art. When Miss Robbins did think one of Beezus's paintings was good enough to put up on the wall, she always tacked it way down at the end, never in the center. Beezus wished she could have a painting in the center of the wall. "Hurry up, Ramona," Beezus coaxed. Then she noticed that her sister was dragging a string along behind her. "Oh, Ramona," she protested, "why did you have to bring Ralph with you?" Ralph was an imaginary green lizard Ramona liked to pretend that she was leading by a string. "I love Ralph," said Ramona firmly, "and Ralph likes to go to the park." Beezus knew it was easier to pretend along with Ramona than to make her stop. Anyway, it was better to have her pretend to lead a lizard than to pretend to be a lizard herself. "Can't you carry him?" she suggested. "No," said Ramona. "He is slimy." When the girls came to the shopping district, Ramona had to stop at the drugstore scales and pretend to weigh herself while Beezus held Ralph's string. "I weigh 11 pounds, she announced, while Beezus smiled at Ramona's idea of her weight. "It just goes to show how much imagination Ramona has," she thought. At the radio and phonograph store, Ramona insisted on petting his master's voice, the black and white plaster dog that always sat with one ear cocked in front of the door. Beezus thought admiringly about the amount of imagination it took to pretend that a scarred and chipped plaster dog was real. If only she had imagination like Ramona's, maybe Miss Robbins would say that her paintings were free and imaginative and would tack them in the middle of the wall. So here is a picture of Ramona dragging her rope, her imaginary lizard, Ralph. When she reached the park, Beezus left Ramona and Ralph at the sand pile, and feeling more and more discouraged at her own lack of imagination, hurried to the recreation center. The class had already poured paints into their muffin tins and were painting on paper thumbtacked to drawing boards. The room hummed with activity. Miss Robbins, wearing a gay paint-smeared smock, flew from one artist to another, praising, correcting, suggesting. Beezus waited until Miss Robbins finished explaining to a boy that he should not outline a mouth with black paint. Her mouth wasn't outlined in black, was it? Then Beezus said, "I'm sorry I'm late, Miss Robbins." She stared in fascination at Miss Robbins' earrings. They came almost to her shoulders and were made of silver wire, twisted and bent into interesting shapes. Not the shape of anything in particular, just interesting shapes. "That's all right, Miss Robbins," her earrings swinging, smiled at Beezus. "Get your paints and paper. Today everyone is painting an imaginary animal." "An imaginary animal," Beezus repeated blankly. How could she possibly think of an imaginary animal? Miss Beezus poured paints into her muffin tin and tacked a sheet of paper to her drawing board. She tried to think of an imaginary animal. But all of the animals that she could think of, cats and dogs and cows and horses and lions and giraffes, were discouragingly real. Reluctantly, Beezus took the only vacant seat, which was beside a boy named Wayne, who came to the class only because his mother made him. Once Beezus had hung her sweater on the back of a chair and Wayne had printed "Post no bills" on it in chalk. Beezus had worn it all the way home before she discovered it. Since then, she did not care to sit beside Wayne. Today, she noticed he had parked a grape-flavored lollipop on a paper towel beside his muffin tin of paints. "Hi, Bees," he greeted her. "No fair licking my sucker." "I don't want your old sucker," answered Beezus, "and don't call me Bees." "Okay, Bees," said Wayne. At that moment, the door opened and Ramona walked into the room. She was still dragging the string behind her, and she looked angry. "Why, hello," said Miss Robbins pleasantly. "Oh, Ramona, you're supposed to be playing in the sand pile," said Beezus, going over to her. "No," said Ramona flatly. "Howie threw sand on Ralph." Her dark eyes were busy taking in the paints, the brushes, and the drawing board. "I'm going to paint," she announced. "Mother said you were supposed to play in the sand pile," protested Beezus. "You're too little for this class." "You say that about everything," complained Ramona, and then she turned to Miss Robbins. "Don't step on Ralph," she said. "Ralph is a make-believe green lizard she pretends to lead around on a string." Beezus was embarrassed at having to explain such a silly thing. Miss Robbins laughed. "Well, here is a little girl with lots of imagination. How would you like to paint a picture of Ralph for us, Ramona?" Beezus could not help feeling annoyed. Miss Robbins was letting Ramona stay in the class, the one place where she was never allowed to tag along. Miss Robbins would probably like her painting because it was so full of imagination. Ramona's pictures, in fact, were so full of imagination that it took even more imagination to tell what they were. Ramona beamed at Miss Robbins, who found a drawing board for her and a stool, which she placed between Beezus and Wayne. She lifted Ramona onto the stool. "There, now you can share your sister's paints," she said. Ramona looked impressed at being allowed to paint with such big boys and girls. She sat quietly on her stool, watching everything around her. "Maybe she'll behave herself after all," thought Beezus as she dipped her brush into the blue paint. "And now I don't have to sit next to Wayne." Since Beezus still had not thought of an imaginary animal, she decided to start with the sky. "Do the sky first," Beezus whispered to Ramona, who looked as if she did not know how to begin. When Beezus faced her own work, determined to be free and imaginative. To be free on a piece of paper was not as easy as it sounded, she thought. Miss Robbins always said to start with the big areas of the picture and paint them bravely and boldly. So Beezus spread the sky on her paper with brave, bold strokes. back and forth across the paper. She swept her brush, brave and bold and free. That was the way to do it. And here is the art class with Miss Robbins setting up Ramona in between Beezus and Wayne. Her sky turned out to be too wet, so while it dried a little, Beezus looked at what the other boys and girls were doing. Cecilia, who sat on her left, had already filled in a brave, bold background of pink, which she had sprinkled with blue and purple dots. Now she was painting a long gray line that wound all over her paper, in and out around the dots. "What's that supposed to be?" whispered Beezus. "I'm not sure yet," answered Cecilia. Beezus felt better. While Cecilia was the kind of girl who usually knew exactly what she was doing and whose pictures were often tacked in the center of the wall, the boy on the other side of Cecilia, who always wanted to paint airplanes, was painting what looked like a giraffe made of pieces of machinery, and another boy was painting a thing that had 2 heads. Beezus looked at Ramona and then across to Wayne. He had not bothered with the sky at all. He had painted a hen. Beezus knew it was a hen because he had printed in big letters, "This is a real hen," with an arrow pointing to it. Wayne always tried to do just the opposite of what Miss Robbins wanted. "Hey, quit peeking," said Wayne in a loud voice. "I'm not peeking," said Beezus, hastily trying to look as if she had been interested in Ramona's paper all the time. Ramona had dipped her brush into blue paint and had painted a blue stripe across the top of her paper. "That's the sky," she said happily. "But that's not the way the sky is." Beezus was trying to be helpful. She felt better because Ramona had not plunged in and painted a picture full of imagination. Skies should come farther down on the paper. "The sky is up," said Ramona firmly. Beezus decided she couldn't waste time explaining about skies, not when she still hadn't thought of an imaginary animal. Maybe she could take a real animal and sort of change it around. "Let's see," she thought. "I could take a horse and put feathers on it. No, all those feathers would be too hard to paint. Wings? That was it." A horse with wings was an imaginary animal, a real imaginary animal, because Mother had once read a story aloud about Pegasus, the winged horse, out of a library book. In the story, Pegasus had been white, which was a real horse color. Beezus decided to be extra imaginative. She would make her horse green, a green horse against a blue sky. Miss Robbins ought to like that. Beezus did not think blue and green looked very pretty together, but Miss Robbins often liked colors that Beezus thought did not really go together. Beezus dipped her brush into green paint and outlined a wing against the sky. Next, she outlined the body of the horse and a long tail that hung down. It was a magnificent horse tail. At least, Beezus hoped it would look magnificent when she finished it. Anyway, it was big, because Miss Robbins liked her artist to cover the whole paper. Quickly and neatly, Beezus filled in the outline of the horse, because Miss Robbins, who was looking at Cecilia's picture, would look at hers next. Somehow, the horse was not exactly what Beezus had in her mind's eye, but even so, compared to whatever Cecilia was painting, a green horse with wings was really a very good imaginary animal. And except for a few soggy places in the sky, her work was much neater than Cecilia's. Beezus waited for Miss Robbins to point this out. Instead, Miss Robbins said, "Cecilia, your picture is work to be proud of. It is a difficult thing to get to be as free as this." Then Miss Robbins moved on to Beezus, her long earrings swinging forward as she leaned over the drawing board. Beezus waited anxiously. Maybe her picture wasn't so good after all. If Miss Robbins liked a gray line winding around a lot of purple dots, maybe she wouldn't like a flying horse. Maybe she liked things with no special shape, like those earrings. You have a good sky, even if it is a little wet, said Miss Robbins. And Beezus was disappointed. Anybody could have a good sky. Miss Robbins continued to study the picture. Try to think how a horse would look if it were really flying. Beezus tried to think. What about the tail? Asked Miss Robbins. Wouldn't the tail fly out behind instead of hanging down? Especially if the wind blew real hard, said Wayne. Can't you make the horse look rounder? Asked Miss Robbins. Think how a horse looks when the sun is shining on him. Part of him would be in shadow. Not that horse, said Wayne. She just copied it off of Mobile Gas billboard, only she made it green instead of red. I did not, said Beezus indignantly. Then she stared at her painting again. Now that Wayne pointed it out, she could see her horse did look like the one on the Mobile Gas billboard at the service station where her father bought gasoline. He was a flat cardboard horse, not a magnificent horse at all. Her horse wasn't even as good as the horse on the billboard, because instead of a flying tail, he had a tail that hung down like a mop. All right, Wayne, said Miss Robbins. I'm sure Beezus did not mean to copy anything from a billboard. No, I didn't, said Beezus mournfully. I was only trying to change a real animal around to make it imaginary, but I just don't have any imagination at all. Why, Beezus, of course you have imagination. Miss Robbins sounded shocked at the idea of anyone not having an imagination. My little sister has lots of imagination, said Beezus. Everybody says so. Miss Robbins smiled reassuringly. That doesn't mean that you don't have any. I think your trouble is that you work too hard. You don't have to be so neat. Why don't you start another painting and just try to have a good time with your paints? Beezus looked uncertain. It was a nice change to have a grown-up tell her she didn't have to be neat, but she didn't understand how she could paint a good picture unless she worked at it. If only she had some imagination like Ramona. But no, Miss Robbins had said everyone had imagination. Well, if she did have imagination, where was it? Why wasn't it helping her with her imaginary animal? All she could think of was that cardboard horse on the billboard. Beezus glanced at Ramona, who had been surprisingly quiet for a long time, to see if she was coming along with her picture of Ralph. Except for the stripe of the sky at the top, Ramona's paper was blank. Now she dipped her brush in yellow paint, divided the hairs of the brush into 3 tufts, and pressed them on the paper, leaving a mark like the track of a bird. That's not the way to use a paintbrush, said Beezus. Besides, you're getting paint all over your fingers. Look, Ralph's feet marks, exclaimed Ramona, paying no attention to Beezus. You mean footprints? Corrected Beezus. Now go on and paint the rest of Ralph. Feet marks, said Ramona stubbornly, making more footprints across the paper. And I can't paint him because he's just pretend. Oh well, thought Beezus, maybe making footprints isn't good for the brush, but it keeps her quiet. She dabbled her own brush in green paint and tried to stir up her imagination. She felt a little encouraged because Ramona was having trouble too. Hey, interrupted Wayne in a loud voice, she's licking my sucker. Ramona! Beezus was horrified to see Ramona, no longer interested in footprints, calmly sucking Wayne's grape-flavored lollipop. Ramona, put that down this instant. You're not supposed to lick other people's suckers. You give me that. Wayne made a grab for his lollipop. No, screamed Ramona, trying to hold it out of his reach. I want it. Ramona, give it to him, ordered Beezus. It is all germy. You mean she's getting germs on it, said Wayne. Give it to me. The rest of the class stopped painting to watch. Wayne made another grab for his lollipop. This time he grabbed Ramona by the wrist. Let go of her, said Beezus angrily. Ramona howled as Wayne tried to pry her fingers loose from the lollipop stick. He knocked against his muffin tin, which flipped into the air, splattering paint over the table, the drawing boards, and the floor. Ramona was splashed with red and yellow paint. Blue and green ran down Wayne's jeans onto his sneakers. A pool of brown paint dripped off the table onto the floor. "Now see what you did," said Wayne after he had pried the sucker out of Ramona's fist. "See what you did," contradicted Beezus, "picking on my sister like that." She picked up the paper towel the sucker had been resting on and began to wipe the spatters off of Ramona, who continued to howl. "Boys and girls," Miss Robbins raised her voice, "let's be quiet. When the room is quiet, I know you are thinking. Lots of people don't know you have to think while you paint." Then she turned to Wayne. "All right, Wayne, you may get a damp cloth and wipe up the paint." "I'm sorry, Miss Robbins," said Beezus. "I want the sucker!" screamed Ramona. Suddenly, Beezus decided that she had had enough. This art class was one place where Ramona was not supposed to be. She was supposed to play in the sandpile. Mother had said so. So she was not supposed to upset the class and spoil everything with one of her tantrums. Beezus made up her mind she was going to do something about it, and right now, too, though she didn't know what. There is Ramona having a little fight with Wayne over the lollipop, and there go the muffin tins and the paint all over the floor. "Ramona, stop that this instant," Beezus ordered. "Go out and play in the sand pile where you belong. Or I'll... Frantically, Beezus tried to think of what she could do. Then she had an inspiration. "Or I'll tickle you," she finished. "I guess I do have some imagination, after all," she thought triumphantly. Instantly, Ramona stopped crying. She hugged herself and stared at Beezus. "Don't tickle, Beezus," she begged. "Please don't tickle. Then go out and play in the sand pile.